No, Kirk, the game's not over. To the last, I will grapple with thee.
Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan is considered by many fans to be the best Star Trek movie, and it's definitely one of my favorites. However, I must admit that I'm getting tired of the reasons invoked by the fans to set it above all the other films and the consequences that this had on the other films, and sometimes even on the series. When we look on the internet what people have to say about The Wrath of Khan, we come across many articles that start the same way. That is, by saying that the motion picture had been poorly received by fans because it was slow and cerebral. After which, these articles claim that if The Wrath of Khan is so good, it's because its director, Meyer, took the opposite direction. He made an action movie in which the Enterprise faces a villain more charismatic than the mysterious V'ger. If you watched my episode on Star Trek the Motion Picture, then you know it's a movie that I really like. It was also through the first two films that I first learned about Star Trek, and it never occurred to me to compare them or to raise one above the other, because comparing two works of art that we like amounts to looking for flaws that wouldn't bother us in other circumstances. To this day, I consider these two films to be too different to compare, and in my opinion, they both contain ingredients that are necessary for Star Trek. Sure, you could argue that The Wrath of Khan is a better movie than the motion picture because it's faster and its villain is more charismatic, but that means you're looking at both movies through a lens that favors the action movies, the very narrow lens of an audience that considers slow movies to be automatically bad, and that a good movie should always end with an explosion.
I want the movie to end with a big explosion.
On the other hand, one might as well argue that the motion picture is better than The Wrath of Khan because it uses science fiction to develop a deep reflection on humanity, and its antagonist is far more compelling than a man obsessed with revenge. If since 40 years The Wrath of Khan is considered to be the best Star Trek film, it's not because it beats the motion picture on every grounds, but rather because since 40 years we only ever judge movies on one ground. A film now only has to answer one question: did it entertain us?
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
Starting with The Wrath of Khan, released in 1982, Star Trek bowed to the success and ubiquity of commercial films like Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and The Wrath of Khan was even the first film not produced by George Lucas to use ILM for its special effects. Like Star Wars, The Wrath of Khan presents a future that is old, a fight between good and evil, and the plot is about the quest for an object that both sides are fighting for, what George Lucas mistakenly calls a MacGuffin. Moreover, if you have already watched Star Wars A New Hope and Star Trek The Wrath of Khan in French, maybe you have noticed that it was François Chaumet who dubbed Khan and Darth Vader.
Ainsi vous n'avez pas oublié, amiral. Quel honneur vous me faites.
La boucle est maintenant bouclée. Quand je vous ai quitté, j'étais votre disciple. Aujourd'hui, je suis le maître.
But why this obsession with good and evil in American cinema from the 80s?
So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
Ronald Reagan was President of the United States from 1981 to 1989. He was the President of the 80s, the President of the most intense phase of the Cold War, when the conflict, always on the background of nuclear threat, moved to the Middle East. Under his administration, the United States experienced not only a strong remilitarization, but also the military entertainment complex, that is, the cooperation between the American Department of Defense and entertainment industries, increased its efforts in order to improve the image of the American Army after its failure in Vietnam. The same way Reagan did everything in his power to convince Americans they were the good guys in a Mannequin story, Hollywood no longer questioned its heroes like it was the case in the 60s and 70s.
Can that be true? Was Cestus III an intrusion on their space?
It may well be possible, Doctor. We know very little about that section of the galaxy.
Then we could be in the wrong.
In The Wrath of Khan, we discover that Starfleet has become militarized, and through the gaze of the scientific community, whose uniforms are aptly reminiscent of the scientific mission in the motion picture, we discover that the public opinion is not as unanimous as believed regarding Starfleet's methods and intentions.
Every time we have dealings with Starfleet, I get nervous.
This militarization is also due to Nicholas Meyer, who did not share the optimism of Gene Roddenberry, the latter having been forced out of the production of the film after the motion picture disappointed the fans. When it was decided that Meyer would be directing the sequel to the motion picture, several scripts were proposed, but none of them worked. What Meyer did at that moment is a real lesson in screenwriting. He took the best elements from each script and combined them to make one movie. It's a crazy idea, but an effective one, thanks to which Meyer has made a film that knows no downtime because no less than 5 intrigues intertwine. The Enterprise is called on a mission during a routine inspection by Kirk, while the crew consists mostly of inexperienced recruits.
I know that none of you were expecting this. I'm sorry.
I'm going to have to ask you to grow up a little bit sooner than you expected.
Scientists develop Genesis, a confidential research project that aims to adapt uninhabitable planets for humanoid life, but which can also be used as a weapon of mass destruction.
We are dealing with something that could be perverted into a dreadful weapon.
Khan, a former adversary Kirk abandoned on Ceti Alpha 5 after he tried to take the Enterprise from him in the episode Space Seed, wants his revenge.
You still remember. I cannot help but be touched. I, of course, remember you.
Kirk meets his son.
Is that Dave?
And Spock sacrifices himself for the Enterprise and her crew.
I'm sorry, Doctor. I have no time to discuss this logically.
Meyer had been asked to make a film that would have a faster pace than the motion picture. He made 5 films in one. But while that's an effective technique for making a movie with no downtime, it's also what makes The Wrath of Khan feel like it lacks a thematic unity. Sure, the film touches on several themes.
Revenge is a dish that is best served cold.
I don't like to lose.
How we deal with death is at least as important as how we deal with life, wouldn't you say?
Life from lifelessness.
Before you really do grow old.
Galloping around the cosmos is a game for the young, Doctor.
And I'm your friend.
You are also my friend.
To summarize the film in its entirety, one could try to bring all these themes together and say that The Wrath of Khan is about the relationship we have with death throughout our lives, through our aging, our failures, our friendships, and those who are thirsty for revenge. But it's still a very vague statement that, in my opinion, hides a lesson that Khan and even the Federation should hear. A lesson Kirk learns over the course of the film and which Spock has no doubt already learned. But I want to warn you, you may find my arguments far-fetched because Nicholas Meyer is, by his own words, a very instinctive storyteller. He quotes literary works from memory, sometimes making a few errors.
It's a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done before. A far better resting place I go to than I've ever known.
And gives the public the responsibility to discover the meaning of these quotes. Of course, some are more obvious than others.
It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Message, Spock?
None that I'm conscious of.
In A Tale of Two Cities, Dr. Alexandre Manet is imprisoned in the Bastille for 18 years, as Khan is imprisoned for 15 years on Ceti Alpha 5, and as Kirk experiences a kind of psychological imprisonment himself.
Damn it, Jim, what the hell is the matter with you? Other people have birthdays. Why are we treating yours like a funeral?
Bones, I don't want to be lectured.
While the final sacrifice of Spock is an echo of that of Sidney Carton at the end of the same novel.
It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known.
In Paradise Lost, after God condemns him to hell, Lucifer returns to try to pervert God's creation. If Kirk is God, the sacrifice and, spoiler alert, the future resurrection of Spock in the third film undeniably makes him the Christ. And it's poor Dr. McCoy who finds himself welcoming the Holy Spirit.
Remember.
Some people, and even Meyer himself, believe his literary references are groundbreaking in Star Trek.
I remember saying when we were talking about this movie, why can't they ever read a book? Why can't they ever do anything we do?
But the reference to Paradise Lost was already there since Khan's first appearance.
Have you ever read Milton, Captain?
Yes. I understand. The statement Lucifer made when he fell into the pit. It is better to rule in hell than serve in heaven.
This is also the case with the references to Moby Dick found in the original series, notably in the episodes The Doomsday Machine and Obsession, in the Wrath of Khan, of course.
For hate's sake, I spit my last breath at thee.
And again on other occasions later.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt your little quest. Captain Ahab has to go hunt his whale.
Since Khan is freed from years of imprisonment that cost him his wife, and since the movie is about his revenge, it's odd that Meyer doesn't refer to Le Comte de Monte Cristo. But maybe that's only because he's more familiar with English literature, even going so far as to include slightly eccentric references to Shakespeare into the other Star Trek film he wrote and directed, The Undiscovered Country.
You have not experienced Shakespeare until you have read him in the original Klingon.
The title of that sixth Star Trek film is itself proof that the quotes chosen by Meyer are not as thoughtful as one might think, since he had also proposed this title for The Wrath of Khan, while Walter Koenig had proposed Star Trek II, Chekhov's Screams Again. All kidding aside, while Meyer and the screenwriters who helped write The Wrath of Khan may not have thought of everything I'm about to highlight, I want to give the film the same attention I gave to the motion picture.
Thank you for your attention.
While the two first movies were released only 3 years apart, the motion picture takes place approximately 2.5 years after the legendary 5-year mission, and The Wrath of Khan 10 years later, assuming the real gap of about 15 years between the original series and this new movie, and also assuming that the characters are now much older.
Now what is that supposed to mean?
Although not mentioned in the movies, fans know that the encounter between the Enterprise and V'ger started the second 5-year mission, at the end of which Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, more mature from what they experienced in the motion picture, were able to preserve their friendship, unlike what had happened after their first separation. So even though Kirk no longer travels through space aboard the Enterprise, he's much less bitter than in the first film. You could say it's for him both the best of times and the worst of times.
Jim, I'm your doctor, and I'm your friend. Get back your command. Get it back before you turn into part of this collection. Before you really do grow old.
If Kirk's starting point may seem similar in the two films, the beginning of The Wrath of Khan differs from that of the motion picture on one very specific point. Kirk is now wiser. He has learned the lesson of the motion picture. He does not claim command of the Enterprise, especially since Spock is now the captain, and in any case, he's certainly more humble, maybe even a little too much.
Of course. The ship is yours.
No, that won't be necessary.
It's Spock who defends him when his authority and expertise are questioned.
May I quote General Order 12? On the approach of any vessel when communications have not been established.
Lieutenant, the Admiral is well aware of the regulations.
Spock also almost has to force Kirk's hand into accepting command of the Enterprise.
You take the ship.
Jim, you proceed from a false assumption. I'm a Vulcan. I have no ego to bruise.
Not that humility or the ability to recognize one's mistakes are faults, but there's a difference between thinking a little less about oneself and thinking a little less of oneself. Kirk holds in very high esteem the man he was in his youth, and as a result, he underestimates the man he has become. He sees his aging as a loss of his best assets, which prevents him from seeing the new qualities he has gained and which makes him a much different person than the original series predicted in the episode where a strange radiation makes him age rapidly.
I fail to understand why each one of my commands is being questioned.
If he weren't pressuring himself to still be the Superman he believes he was in his youth, Kirk would see that he's wiser today and could share his experience with new recruits for their own benefit as well as his own. Just as Khan is a prisoner of Ceti Alpha 5, Kirk is a prisoner of his nostalgia, of the envy he feels for his past. And look at that! His past comes back in the form of 3 faults he committed in his youth. that of having abandoned Khan and his crew on Ceti Alpha 5 rather than handing them over to justice and without ever worrying about their fate.
Ceti Alpha 6 exploded 6 months after we were left here. The shock shifted the orbit of this planet and everything was laid waste. Admiral Kirk never bothered to check on our progress.
That of having been absent from the life of his son to instead keep playing the space cowboy.
I did what you wanted. I stayed away. Why didn't you tell me?
How can you ask me that? Were we together? Were we going to be? You had your world, and I had mine. And I wanted him in mine, not chasing through the universe with his father.
And that of having avoided death even at the cost of what it could have taught him. Indeed, what made Kirk such a fascinating hero in the series is revisited by Meyer, who exposes his dark side. Already in his novel The 7-Person Solution, which I have never read but whose film adaptation is definitely one of the 2 best Sherlock Holmes films along with The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes by Billy Wilder, Meyer has demonstrated his talent for deconstructing famous heroes. But we have to be careful with the term deconstruct, that has become an overused term for people when they review a movie. Deconstructing doesn't mean turning a character or a movie on its head without any explanation and spitting on what he once represented. Jake Skywalker, to use the words of Mark Hamill himself, is not a deconstruction of Luke Skywalker. While Luke refused at the risk of his life, that of his loved ones and the well-being of the galaxy to kill Darth Vader, child killer who terrorized the galaxy and tortured its inhabitants for several years and who was planning to corrupt Leia, Jake Skywalker breaks into his nephew's room in the middle of the night to murder him in his sleep because of a bad feeling. Alright, so if you agree with what I just said, then I'm preaching to converts. And if you disagree, then no matter how many or how good my arguments are, you'll never change your mind, and that's okay. But what you have to remember is that The Last Jedi didn't deconstruct Luke Skywalker any more than Jurassic World deconstructed Jurassic Park by contradicting the thesis of the first movie. To deconstruct a character or a film is to reveal contradictions which have always been present, but which we have not seen until now. Robin and Marianne reveals to us that given that Robin Hood has spent his life robbing rich people in the forest and going on crusades, he's probably not as cultured and respectable as a sheriff of Nottingham who has access to literature and education. Unforgiven reveals that since cowboys frequented saloons so often before dueling each other, they must not have been aiming that well. And not only their exploits were surely exaggerated by those who told of them, but these cowboys probably didn't have a clear conscience. Mist of Avalon reveals Morgan's point of view on the Arthurian cycle, and without altering its story too much, alters our opinion of Arthur's sister. Twin Peaks reveals the absurdity of soap operas while adopting its codes and improbability. Goodfellas, Casino, and The Wolf of Wall Street reveal that criminals are not Shakespearean heroes like in The Godfather, but just pretentious delinquents. Superman Red Sun reveals that Superman's values partly depend on where he lands on Earth. And Dragon Ball Z Battle of the Gods reveals that Goku's obsession with personal achievement in detriment to the safety of the world makes him a hero who's not as pure as once believed, and that Vegeta is far more mature and responsible than him. Despite all these revelations, none of these works distorted what they deconstructed. Nothing was unwarranted. This is the case in The Wrath of Khan and in the motion picture as well, in which Kirk is twice deconstructed. And it's also the original series itself that is deconstructed in The Wrath of Khan. Because if Kirk could afford to abandon Khan on a planet without facing the consequences of this decision afterwards, it's because the series, episodic in nature, almost never made reference to previous adventures. The series presented Kirk as a superactive adventurer who multiplied love conquests in a context where this behavior made him shine, without ever showing the irresponsible father he would be if one of these conquests told him that she was pregnant. Finally, throughout the series, Kirk was portrayed as a trickster who cheated death by treating life like a game of poker.
Not chess, Mr. Spock. Poker.
However, in life, we learn much more from our mistakes and our failures than from our victories. In other words, Kirk has learned nothing from his multiple victories and considers that his lack of failures is proof of his superiority.
I tricked my way out of death and patted myself on the back for my ingenuity.
In The Wrath of Khan, we are told that Kirk cheated on the Kobayashi Maru test that aims to confront future captains against assured defeat. Thus, when the bluff does not allow him to win, Kirk resorts to cheating. While his character was modeled on John F. Kennedy in the original series or Lyndon B. Johnson in the episodes that supported the Vietnam War, the now older Kirk serves to criticize Ronald Reagan, the oldest president the United States had ever known at the time, and his strategy for winning the Cold War.
I don't like to lose.
Of course, Reagan and Meyer will say that this strategy worked for him, but when we look at what's happening right now in Ukraine, we see that we're still suffering the consequences of this arrogance today, and we have to wonder if there was ever a win, or what we consider to be a win.
Do you ever win a fight?
Nobody ever wins a fight.
The Star Trek reboot written by Alex Kurtzman, which is strongly inspired by The Wrath of Khan, exaggerates what The Wrath of Khan told us about Kirk's past and reduces him to a spoiled child who doesn't listen to nobody and cheats all the time. Although the success of this new Star Trek has been associated with the election of Obama, this Kirk is more similar to George W. Bush, a president who was known for trusting his instinct and for his refusal to play by the rules. This Kirk, like Bush, is convinced that he's better than everyone and that he has the right to break the rules as he pleases. According to Alejandro Barcenas and Steve Bain, this attitude is acceptable if Kirk is a Junzi, which Confucius defines as a virtuous leader who's superior to everyone, a concept that is reminiscent of Nietzsche's Superman. Pike tells Kirk, "You think the rules don't apply to you because you disagree with them." The Junzi would politely correct him. "It's not that the rules don't apply because I disagree with them. They don't apply when I disagree with them, and I only disagree with them when they prevent me from being a virtuous leader." Despite this elegant justification, the problem remains the same. Whether in the original series or in the reboot where he's flanderized, Kirk gives himself the right to bluff and cheat because he believes himself to be superior, which is not to say that he doesn't care about his crew and doesn't consult with them before making a decision, in the original series anyway. But it turns out that Khan cares about his crew too, and Khan also thinks he's superior.
You have proved your superior intellect.
Because Khan is, in the Star Trek universe, a product of eugenics from the 1990s. In other words, a real Superman. Although Space Scene and The Wrath of Khan do not develop a very in-depth discourse on the limits and consequences of eugenics like Brave New World or Gattaca would, it's still important to explain what it is. There are several ways to explain what eugenics is. It can be a racist ideology, a pseudoscientific theory, and an institutional practice. Either way, eugenics aims to improve the population through artificial selection. For example, in the United States during the 20th century, about 70,000 people were sterilized on the pretext that they were inferior. People who had never been able to enroll in school, for example because they could not afford it or because their skin was not of the authorized color, were given a written test, and in view of their poor results, they were diagnosed as morons. Proponents of eugenics also believe that the white race descended from a superior Nordic race. And it was on the basis of both these beliefs and the laws of Jim Crow that Adolf Hitler developed his anti-Semitic theories and his final solution. Americans may have been outraged at what they found in Europe when they went to fight the Nazis, but all of this had been generated at home.
We think about Anne Frank dying in a concentration camp because the Germans thought the Jews were genetically inferior. But to some extent, Anne Frank died in a concentration camp because the US Congress believed that as well.
The wacky arguments used to defend eugenics unfortunately continue to find followers, even though they have long been refuted by the scientific community, especially since it was discovered that lack of education because of lack of money or because of discrimination is not a genetic problem, but a sociological one. Since the Holocaust, it has become less acceptable to pretend that certain ethnicities are inferior to others.
Surtout sur un certain âge, la race.
Which is why the terms ethnicity or race are now replaced by culture in speeches that are otherwise exactly the same as those of the eugenicists at the beginning of the 20th century.
Explain, if it has nothing to do with culture, explain to me why the single motherhood rate in the black community jumped from 20% to 70%.
Khan may truly have been designed to have a superior intellect, but his exile on City Alpha 5 turned him into an idiot blinded by revenge. Hear me out. Khan is an excellent villain, brilliantly interpreted by Ricardo Montalban. Hating Kirk with every fiber of his body, he enjoys the harm he causes him and knows exactly where to strike. Where to strike to cripple the Enterprise, and where to strike to hurt Kirk, because as I said earlier, Kirk is, just like Khan, dedicated to his crew. But Khan is a man of the past, manipulative, violent, and toxic, while Kirk is a man of the future, humble, responsible, and aware that you can move up and down in space.
This pattern indicates two-dimensional thinking.
Unlike Kirk, age hasn't weakened Khan, but again, unlike Kirk, he doesn't listen to his crew. His reasoning is flawed and he's destined to lose. Yet, Khan has everything he needs to win. He managed to flee City Alpha 5 and he has Genesis in his possession, but his hatred for Kirk makes him so stupid that he's unable to see Genesis for what it is. The means to offer a paradise planet to his crew as well as to himself. In his hands, even life-creating technology is reduced to a weapon to kill Kirk, to the detriment of his own well-being and that of his crew.
Yours is superior.
While Kirk has freed himself from his psychological prison, Khan replaced his prison on City Alpha 5 with the prison of his thirst for revenge. A thirst so insatiable that he ends up sacrificing everything he holds dear: his freedom, his crew, his paradise, and his life. I like Khan's character because he's dumb. I am amused to see how much his anger consumes him. If Kirk and his crew manage to defeat Khan, who's supposedly superior to them, then what does it really mean to be superior?
Me, Prince Vegeta, the greatest warrior in the universe, is actually being forced to retreat!
In the end, eugenics do not create superior beings, but only beings corresponding to what eugenicists consider to be superior. If the eugenicists are old white men full of themselves, then for them, a superior being is an old white man full of himself. Of course, Khan is not white. He's a character of Indian origin, interpreted by a Mexican actor, because Gene Roddenberry considered that in the future, culture would not be dependent on ethnicity, a reasoning shared by George Takei, who opted for the rapier rather than the Japanese sword when he was allowed to choose the weapon wielded by Sulu in the episode The Naked Time. However, in Space Seed's original script, Khan was supposed to be Scandinavian and called Harold Eriksson. Surely a reference to the Aryan race theory, the series having confronted the Enterprise more than once with a Nazi-inspired threat. While in Star Trek humans are dedicated to personal and collective moral betterment, Khan represents the false good idea of an ancient humanity who believed that the betterment of society depended on a discriminatory selection of the individuals who compose it and on the genetic manipulation of a self-proclaimed elite, just like the Borg would later represent the false good idea of relying heavily on technology to achieve the same goal. These are the lazy strategies of an elite who in no way seek to ensure a promising future for all, but only a promising future for a fraction of society. A future built on the corpses of those who do not resemble the elite. Which brings me to talk about Genesis. Because Genesis also serves to create a future not for all extraterrestrial life forms, but only for terrestrial species and those who can adapt to it. Like V'ger in the motion picture, Genesis is once again some sort of a Frankenstein's monster. This time because it's about the creation from a group of scientists seeking to generate life from death. And it's a creation which also possesses a destructive power reminiscent of the atomic bomb. In the same way Ian Malcolm opposes the cloning of dinosaurs,
your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
McCoy raises the moral implications of Genesis, but he's ignored.
I do not dispute that in the wrong hands.
In the wrong hands? Would you mind telling me who's in the right hands, my logical friend?
In reality, the argument of the opponents of planetary engineering is less philosophical. In a way, we have already demonstrated our ability to transform a planet, our planet, which we have turned into a burning garbage can. If we don't solve this problem first, there's no point in terraforming another planet that will treat the same way. If you mistreat a child, it's not by bringing a second child into the world that you'll become a better parent. In other words, if we don't change our behavior, if, like the Elon Musks of this world, we choose the easy way out, and we prefer to run away from our problems rather than roll up our sleeves and work to solve them, a humanity that would develop planetary engineering would only turn more planets into burning garbage cans. Like the eugenicists, we would have sacrificed the natural beauty and diversity of the world to conform them to our preferences of the moment, thus eliminating any possibility for this planet to develop life forms of its own or to welcome an extraterrestrial species which does not survive under the same conditions as us, and who would need this planet for more noble reasons than ours. Of course, in the future imagined by Star Trek, humanity no longer pollutes. But while the Federation forbids interfering in the development of civilizations that it considers to be inferior to it, it allows itself, through the Genesis Project, to interfere in the development of nature and of life itself, and that for the same reason. Because it considers that the living conditions necessary for the cultures it represents must serve as an example to measure life throughout the universe. Eugenics and planetary engineering have in common the idea that certain people or certain planets can be sacrificed for the good of the population.
Were I to invoke logic, logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
This philosophy comes from utilitarianism, an ethical doctrine that claims to be able to mathematically quantify happiness and well-being to determine a course of action. The Kobayashi Maru test is itself a variation of the famous trolley problem, as YouTuber Jessie Gender points out in her video on the subject, and I invite you to take a look at her channel if you haven't already. Spock's logic is heavily influenced by utilitarianism, yet he has also been seen to make decisions that go against that doctrine. It's because Spock doesn't always let logic dictate his choice, though he refuses to admit it.
You're not going to admit that for the first time in your life, you committed a purely human, emotional act?
No, sir.
Vulcans keep pretending that they can't lie, but often find a way to do it.
Sir, there's a multi-legged creature crawling on your shoulder.
In the same way, Spock claims that it is utilitarianism that dictates his actions. Yet, far from being flawless, this doctrine can be used to justify everything and its opposite.
If all that matters is the sum total of goodness, then you can justify any number of bad actions, like torturing one innocent person to save 100, or preemptive war.
By sacrificing all those who are not white or supposedly descendants of a mythical Nordic race, isn't eugenics instead giving more importance to the well-being of a fraction of the population in a much more diverse world? And by sacrificing the natural state of planets that do not fit the habitable conditions for the species that make up the Federation, isn't planetary engineering instead placing more importance on the well-being of a fraction of the life forms that inhabit the galaxy? As Spock himself will say in the 6th movie,
Logic is the beginning of wisdom, Valeris, not the end.
This is why Spock practices meditation, to enlighten him in his decisions, to determine when utilitarianism is appropriate. At the end of the film, we witness 2 sacrifices, that of Khan and that of Spock. As Shai Bitterman and William J. Devlin say, contrary to Khan's nihilistic sacrifice to try to kill Kirk, Spock's sacrifice affirms life and more closely matches, at least according to Nietzsche, the acts of the Superman. While he's dying, Spock keeps justifying his sacrifice with utilitarianism.
The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
While acknowledging that there is another, much deeper and more important reason.
I have been, and always shall be, your friend.
In doing so, he finally imparts to Kirk the lesson he should have learned long ago, a lesson that makes him wiser than Khan and even wiser than the Federation. True superiority, if such a thing exists, is found not in competition, but in cooperation, not in hatred, but in friendship. Through his contact with the new recruits, confronted with the errors of his past, and at the cost of a terrible sacrifice, Kirk realizes that he has never been superior to others, and this is what finally allows him to appreciate the new qualities given to him by his advanced age. While David never believed for a second that Kirk was a Superman, he's now proud to be his son. Similarly, the Wrath of Khan may have learned from the mistakes of the motion picture, but perhaps we should be careful not to continually judge it superior to the point of erasing all other Star Trek movies and series.
Will Wheaton, my old friend, I've chased you around the moons of Nibia and round the Antares maelstrom and round perdition's flames.
You know you keep quoting Wrath of Khan, but he was in Next Generation as a totally different set of characters.
Silence!
Thematically, the first 3 films form a trilogy about rebirth, death, and resurrection, but on a narrative level, it's rather the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th film which form a trilogy. I know it's complicated, but we've seen worse, and even worse. Still, in the next episodes of this series of video essays, it shouldn't be too difficult for me to explain how the Star Trek films form a coherent whole. At least, less difficult than to explain the transition from a film d'auteur inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey to a blockbuster from the 1980s. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for supporting the channel. If you're a Star Trek fan, I'd like to know what your favorite Star Trek movie is, if you have one, and why you think The Wrath of Khan should or shouldn't be considered the best Star Trek movie. Do you enjoy all the references Star Trek keeps making to The Wrath of Khan, or are you tired of it? Feel free to like and share the video, and of course subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode, which will be uploaded next month.